There's something incredibly captivating about a game that's polarizing. Sure, universally acclaimed releases are great and all, but games that spark a divisive discussion where no side seems to be objectively correct are engaging in a unique way. In 2019, visionary game designer Hideo Kojima released Death Stranding, the first game developed by his independent studio Kojima Productions. To say that Death Stranding was divisive would be an understatement. Some critics lauded the innovative title, coining it Game of the Generation, one of the most important games of the decade, a masterpiece, etc., while others seemingly despised it, calling the game an irredeemable piece of garbage or a bizarre, self-indulgent mess. Witnessing the polarization surrounding Death Stranding left me feeling apprehensive about trying it upon release, especially having never played any of Kojima's other games. I actually was gifted the game for Christmas in 2019 and was ever so close to opening it before making the decision to exchange it for God of War 2018 instead. However, with Death Stranding 2 on the beach set for release this year, I decided I would circle back to the 2019 title to finally give it a try and see what the hype for the acclaimed Kojima was all about. After rolling credits on the game just days before writing this script, I've been left feeling incredibly conflicted. On one hand, between its powerful and well-crafted story and characters, unique mechanics, and unparalleled artistic direction, Death Stranding is one of the most innovative experiences I've ever had in the video game medium. However, its potential greatness is repeatedly disturbed by a gameplay loop that fails to be consistently engaging and some incredibly inconsistent narrative pacing. The reality is, Death Stranding is certainly not an irredeemable piece of garbage, but it also isn't the game of the generation either, rather falling somewhere in between. I don't want to give the false impression that this game is simply mid, as I really enjoyed much of what it has to offer. Unfortunately, it has a few barriers that hold it back from being truly amazing, and that's what's so frustrating. I can clearly see Kojima's brilliant vision here, and am incredibly excited for the sequel as I believe it can amend some of the faults that are holding this game back from reaching its true potential. For now though, I want to dive into the elements that make Death Stranding work so well, but also the ones that cause it to be so divisive. While it's certainly more controversial to pick a side, the reality is, this game isn't quite a mess or a masterpiece, but rather, a little bit of both. Although there's many aspects of Death Stranding that are polarizing, I don't think anyone can deny just how beautiful this game is. Upon booting it up for the first time, I was reminded of the excellence of the Decima engine, as this is one of the best looking games I've ever played, even at 6 years old. I don't think Death Stranding could have been nearly as successful if this were not the case, as the game relies heavily on visuals as a part of its experience. Its cutscenes have some of the best facial animation and detail I've ever seen, which is crucial as they take up over 7 hours of the game's total runtime. More importantly, Death Stranding also looks fantastic within gameplay, primarily within the different environments Sam must traverse. Many of the game's opponents say that it is nothing more than a glorified walking simulator, as its entire premise involves transporting cargo across vast distances, mostly on foot. However, I think that Death Stranding is able to elevate the simple act of walking because of the beauty and sublimity of the game's terrain. Every delivery, which is this game's form of objectives, involves traveling over a certain stretch of the post-apocalyptic American wilderness. Most of the time, I was motivated to complete deliveries more so by the incredible terrain I would get to witness, rather than the actual contents or narrative reasons for each. Whether it's endless rocky tundras, sprawling river valleys, gargantuan mountain ranges, or vast otherworldly plains, each biome of Death Stranding is one filled with immense beauty. Yet it is also a landscape that feels so alien in a way. The tundras and valleys in the game's opening area that supposedly represent the American East Coast feel like some rendition of Iceland, and the rolling red hills in the game's middle area look as if taken straight from the planet of Mars. These are just a few examples of what is a truly fascinating, otherworldly landscape that opposes the typical interpretations of post-apocalyptic America. Death Stranding's world is one that excels in the atmosphere it conveys, which is paramount as you spend dozens of hours trekking across its many corners. Most of the time, I think open world games are flawed in that they feel unintentionally empty, but Death Stranding uses its desolate world to create a vivid sense of loneliness at every moment, echoing Sam's journey perfectly. The world's combination of vast emptiness with raw beauty makes each delivery in this broken America feel authentic and allows you to appreciate the game's little moments. However, Death Stranding's world prevents you from sinking too deeply into sustained moments of comfort due to the many threats it presents. Between the strands that descend from the sky, remains of cities that have been decimated by void-outs, constant downpour of timefall, and oppressive presence of BTs at every corner, there's a looming, haunting feeling riddled throughout this rendition of America. All of these different elements come together to create an atmosphere quite unlike anything else in gaming. On one hand, Death Stranding's world makes you appreciate its raw beauty with endless stretches of magnificent landscapes, yet it also creates an oppressive sense of melancholy due to the threats that have overcome it, making you appreciate that this reality isn't our own. It's one of the most powerful and nuanced tones I've ever seen a game's atmosphere create, and for that, I applaud it. I also can't talk about any of this without mentioning the game's soundtrack. When I first realized that most of Death Stranding's music was licensed voice tracks, I was a little disappointed. I really enjoy the ambient and instrumental tracks of many sci-fi games, so I was unsure if this soundtrack would really be for me. However, I have to say it's pretty incredible. Those little moments when you're slowly traversing the landscape and a song kicks in are indescribable. These different tracks manage to echo both the hopeful but also melancholic nature of Death Stranding's tone perfectly, and it's one of the more unique soundtracks I've seen in the game. I really wish I could include some of it here, but I don't want to get copyrighted and demonetized since I make a ridiculous amount of money on this channel. Death Stranding is an incredibly beautiful experience that's various elements all masterfully come together to convey a fantastic artistic direction. It's one of the most unique, complex atmospheres I've ever felt in a game, and perhaps my favorite part of the experience. Unfortunately, while I deeply appreciated Kojima's vision from an artistic standpoint, I can't say that I meshed with Death Stranding's gameplay mechanics nearly as much. That's not to say it's all bad, as there certainly is some here that works extremely well. First of all, I think the entire premise of the game is fascinating. The walking simulator criticisms I mentioned earlier aren't entirely fair. Yes, Death Stranding does center its gameplay loop primarily around walking, yet it gives new meaning to the action entirely. Walking in video games is something we often take for granted. Holding down a button or key and going from point A to point B is usually something that requires no thought and holds no meaning behind it. Death Stranding flips that idea on its head. The simple act of shifting from side to side to maintain your balance as you walk is such an interesting mechanic and makes you feel the burden of every step Sam takes in this world. Each delivery feels like its own arduous, beautiful journey because of this. You can occasionally choose to travel with some of the vehicles the game gives you, however, not only is there not much variety here, the vehicles typically have a pretty low battery life and are incredibly difficult to use in much of the rocky terrain, as they often get stuck on physical objects in the world, something I hope is improved in the sequel. As a result, I honestly was content just trekking around on foot through this world, especially due to the beauty I mentioned earlier. However, while I think this idea of adding a new meaning to simply walking is interesting, the motivation for this gameplay is where things really started to falter for me. In Death Stranding, you complete dozens of deliveries while trying to reconnect America. The problem is, the cargo you carry means nothing. Sure, one package may be some medical supplies for an injured person, or some materials needed to rebuild a structure, or even a freaking pizza. The problem is, all these items look and act almost entirely the same, so it's up to the characters surrounding these deliveries to give them some sense of meaning. Unfortunately, every delivery follows the same structure. Go to a terminal and select a delivery. A hologram of the NPC requesting the delivery will appear and give a lifeless exposition dump for why you are doing such task. Complete the delivery and experience another hologram with some more robotic dialogue. Rinse, repeat. Death Stranding is a game centered around the importance of human connection, yet none of that is actually present in the gameplay since you aren't interacting with actual people, but rather visual holograms with forgettable, low-quality dialogue.
Nice. The great deliverer comes through again. The server's in perfect condition. It's a real relief to know all our records are safe. Thank you so much.
There's also a lack of incentivizing gameplay rewards for doing deliveries, aside from the occasional cosmetics and maybe a new weapon or structure if you're lucky. I mean, you can receive a higher connection level or mover rank, or even some likes, which is cool, I guess. I don't know. I just never cared for any of that. The lack of any narrative or gameplay motivations for different objectives often left me with no desire to complete them, leading to me skipping almost all optional deliveries. It's a shame because I think the core gameplay mechanics of traversing the world to deliver a piece of cargo is an interesting idea. It just wasn't presented in an incentivizing manner, at least for me personally. I also want to touch on some of the other aspects of Death Stranding's core gameplay, which I actually liked a little more. First of all, the game does occasionally include combat encounters, which I thought were decent enough. These definitely aren't challenging or complex by any means, but they offer a nice change in pace from the rest of the game. I particularly enjoyed some of the battles against the larger VTs, or some of the story boss fights, which I'll get into later. I think expanding on this area of Death Stranding is something that could really elevate its enjoyability, which the sequel has me feeling optimistic about. Another aspect of gameplay that I thought showed a lot of promise, but I hope is improved in the sequel, is the various traversal devices you can use and the structures you can construct to make deliveries easier. I thought being able to construct things such as a road, bridge, generator, shelter, or zipline were very interesting, useful ideas. I also really enjoy the concept that you can use the structures out in the world that have been built by other players, most of which are incredibly helpful. This also makes it feel as if Sam is one of the many porters completing deliveries in this otherwise dangerous, lonely world, and it gives Death Stranding an MMO-like feel to an extent. I just think they could have done a lot more with this and increased the variety of these different structures or their usefulness, so I'm excited to see what ways it's expanded in the sequel. I also want to quickly touch on the act of using a private shelter to recharge in between deliveries. Here, you can interact with a bunch of little stuff in Sam's personal room, such as drinking energy drinks, taking a shower, using the bathroom, changing cosmetics, checking on your BB, etc. I just love small things like this in games, as they manage to really ground the experience, which is paramount in a game like Death Stranding. That's really all I want to cover about Death Stranding's gameplay. As a whole, I think I would just describe it as seeping with promise. Promise that it falls well short of, with mechanics that, while innovative, are held back by unnecessary tedium and lack any real motivation to engage with them. I think the most frustrating part of Death Stranding's gameplay woes is that they hold back what could otherwise be a truly masterful narrative. I came into the game with no real knowledge of any of its story beats or setup, and I'm glad as it ultimately became my favorite part of the experience. Just to preface this section, there will be major story spoilers for the entirety of Death Stranding ahead, so if you haven't played the game and want to, I would recommend skipping to the conclusion section of this video, as this is a story that really does have some incredible twists and turns that shouldn't be ruined. Okay, with that being said, I want to dive into exactly what I thought about a large majority of the narrative of Death Stranding in a sort of SparkNotes manner. The game opens with a cutscene introducing you to the main character Sam, who is riding through a dark, strange version of the future. Death Stranding does a great job of immediately raising intriguing questions about this universe, as you are quickly shown several unfamiliar, bizarre phenomena that are normal occurrences in this world, namely BTs, repatriation, the beach, timefall, dooms, etc. The game doesn't hold your hand and explain all this from the beginning. Instead, you're left to figure it out on your own, which is all the more intriguing. A decent bit into the introduction, Sam is caught up in a void out that decimates an entire city. This was definitely the moment I was fully hooked by this world and the mystery of why it was the way it was. It was a setting that felt so strange and creative compared to most of the other cookie-cutter post-apocalyptic futures pictured in other media, leaving me both intrigued and overwhelmed with questions. Why are there babies in pods attached to people? What are these invisible beings floating in the sky? Why is Sam waking up on some otherworldly beach? Anyway, after the void out, Sam awakens outside one of the game's cities under the custody of an organization called Bridges and is tasked with visiting the President of the United States before her death. As you make your way to the President's bed, it is shockingly revealed that this is actually Sam's mother, who wants to give him her last wish before she dies. Sam's mother, Bridget, ultimately succumbs to her disease in front of him, after which you are assigned the first delivery of the game: bring her body to an incinerator. It's an incredibly powerful and emotional way to introduce you to the simplicity and impact of Death Stranding's gameplay premise, and it's one of the best sequences in the game overall. Once you complete this emotional delivery, Sam is given the main task of Death Stranding: to reconnect the chiral network in an effort to rebuild America, as well as to find his sister Amelie on the West Coast. I love how this goal ties into Death Stranding's literal and figurative focus on connections, strands, knots, etc. throughout both its story and gameplay. Not only is Death Stranding a game about connecting the chiral network to rebuild the country, but it's also about Sam, a hardened, isolated man learning to connect with the people of this world. It's a really beautiful theme that resonates throughout every aspect of the game. This is where the real game begins, as Sam is thrust out into the world in an effort to rebuild America. After completing your first few orders and growing accustomed to the gameplay in these initial hours, you reach Port Knot City, where you are introduced to Higgs, the game's initial villain. Higgs is a very cool, intriguing adversary, thanks partly to an excellent performance by Troy Baker. I mean, he's always great, when is he not? I'll touch more on Higgs in a little bit though. Following your first interaction with him, you make your way into the larger area of the map where the game really opens up gameplay-wise. However, this is where Death Stranding's story started to go downhill for me, as its so far decent pacing disappears. While the game begins with a heavy story focus, this is the point where it falls into a cycle where you are forced to complete several hours of uninteresting deliveries at a time before you can experience a little more of the story. This often left me tuning out of the game while in gameplay-heavy segments, and then trying my best to get reinvested during more story-centered sections. It was difficult to truly do so, however, as I knew right as the plot was getting interesting again, I'd likely be forced back into several more hours of mind-numbing deliveries. I'm not sure if I was the only one to experience this. Maybe those of you who enjoyed these tasks more didn't have this issue. I'm not sure, but that's what I felt. Obviously, every story-focused game has to switch between gameplay and story at some points, or else they would just be movies. I just think Death Stranding doesn't do a great job of effectively balancing this, and the game also doesn't integrate story incentivization well enough into the deliveries, which would certainly help keep things more engaging. When the story moments do come, they are great. Most of the middle episodes are focused on Sam connecting with a particular character. All of these work extremely well, as these different individuals are excellently written with compelling backstories and personalities. Fragile and her traumatic history with Higgs was perhaps my favorite of these, although I also really liked Heartman and his quest for purpose following the death of his wife and daughter, as well as the unique twist behind Deadman's identity. I've seen some critics of Death Stranding say that these characters have bad dialogue and aren't well written, and I just couldn't disagree more. I found all the interactions between Sam and these individuals to be so well executed, as far as to say this may be one of my favorite casts in a video game. Each is impactful in their own way and presents an inspiring representation of the power of connection in this broken world. Speaking of characters, Higgs also reappears here and there, and once again, I really enjoyed him as a villain, as he is both immensely powerful, but also depraved, displayed in his weird, erratic mannerisms. His actions against Fragile in particular show just how messed up he truly is, and really makes you hate him as an individual. The last thing I want to touch on regarding this middle act is the moments where Sam is transported to a beach in the form of a massive historical battlefield. Here, you must defeat a soldier named Clifford Unger, who seems to be connected to the Death Stranding in some way. At first, I was confused about what any of this was, although I liked the change in setting from the rest of the game. However, you eventually start to piece together that this soldier is the same man that is shown every time Sam connects to his BB Lou. I had a lot of intriguing questions about the identity of this person and his goals, which would be answered eventually. So, after finishing this middle section of the game and reaching the west coast, you finally connect the last segment of the chiral network and find Amelie. At this point, you figured out that she is actually an extinction entity, a living being that causes a Death Stranding event or a mass extinction. Once you reach Amelie, you find out Higgs is seemingly using her to trigger the end of the world and must engage in a final battle against him to stop it, first outside of Edge Knot City and then a high-stakes fight on the beach itself, both of which I really enjoyed. However, once you defeat Higgs and think that Death Stranding is coming to an end, you realize this final act is just beginning and things start to get really crazy. On the beach after defeating Higgs, you find Amelie but also see Die Hardman, Clifford Unger, and somehow your mother Bridget. However, at this moment Sam quickly returns to the real world, which is experiencing increasing effects of the Death Stranding as evidenced by the darkening skies and increasing rain. At this point, you have to travel all the way back to the East Coast where you began the game to uncover the truth. I think it's pretty annoying that you have to trek all the way across the map again, as it isn't really explained very well narratively, although it definitely does put into perspective the vast distance Sam has covered in his journey, which I believe was the main intention. On your way back, you start to learn that Amelie may not be who she claims, and may not even exist in the first place, as well as the fact that Clifford Unger is actually not the threat you thought, and somehow knows who Sam is. All of this sets up the true finale masterfully, which I think is the best segment of Death Stranding. Before going onto the beach for what may be his last moments, you get to see how far Sam has truly come in this journey and how he has developed, going from an emotionally isolated, scarred husk of a man into a selfless hero who has relearned how to connect with those around him. At first, I thought Sam was a boring, forgettable protagonist, but by the end of the game, I grew to appreciate his character development immensely. In a heroic, sacrificial moment, Sam is transported one last time to the beach to reach Amelie and confront her to prevent the extinction event. The true twist behind her actually being the soul of Bridget stranded on the beach is so well executed, and it made me feel stupid for not recognizing the clues sooner. It's one of those masterful full circle moments that really ties the themes of Death Stranding together and calls back to much of what you see in the beginning of the game, which was a mystery at the time. After effectively using the extinction as an opportunity to give the world another chance, as well as some incredibly lengthy credit sequences that were making me crash out, you are transported to Inauguration Day, where Die Hardman is set to become the next president of the UCA. At this point, I'm thinking this game has to be over soon, right? And yet Kojima just manages to keep going. But I'm so glad he did, as I believe this final hour or so is what really brings Death Stranding's story to the next level. After Die Hardman's inauguration speech, Sam confronts him and he breaks down in an incredibly heart-wrenching moment where he confesses to killing his captain, Clifford Unger, in the past. This is such a well-acted scene and is another example of just how well written the characters of Death Stranding are. After this, Deadman informs Sam that Lou is out of commission, so as required by protocol, you must take its body to the incinerator. Where Death Stranding's first delivery involved taking the corpse of your mother Bridget to be burned, you must end the game by delivering the body of Lou, who Sam has grown to love in the absence of his past family, to these same flames. The walk back to that incinerator is an incredibly poetic full-circle moment, as Sam seems to be reverting to the isolation he had come so far to break out of on his journey to save America. Everything Sam touches dies, as he himself says. However, these final moments are broken up by cutscenes where you get to experience the truth behind what happened with Clifford Unger, Die Hardman, and Bridget. It's an incredibly heartbreaking, profound sequence highlighted by an excellent performance by Mads Mikkelsen. At the end of this segment, it is revealed in a masterful twist that before his death at the hands of Bridges, Unger removed his BB from its pod, a BB that would later grow up to be Sam. It's an incredible reveal that had me just sitting there like, damn, how did I not know? Especially since there are so many brilliant signs leading up to it. Death Stranding ultimately ends with Sam, in the same way that his father did, removing Lou from her pod at the last moment in an attempt to save her. Holding Lou, Sam steps outside as the weather clears, displaying that the world is indeed healing, and so is he. It's a fantastic ending to what is mostly a fantastic narrative. Death Stranding is a story about the power of connections, about hope in the face of hopelessness. It's a narrative that manages to be so beautiful, but also heartbreaking at the same time, thanks mostly to its characters, which are some of the most well-written and compelling I've seen in a game. In addition, its plot is so masterfully composed, with brilliant twists and turns at every moment. I only wish its pacing wasn't afflicted by hours of monotonous deliveries, as I believe that's what really holds it back from being one of the best, most well-crafted stories I've ever experienced in a game. Regardless, this narrative is the area where Kojima really flexed his creative muscles the most, and its impact is one that lingers far beyond Sam's final delivery. So, to circle back to the debate about Death Stranding being a mess or a masterpiece, what's the final verdict? As I've clearly laid out, it's a game with so much promise in so many areas. The visual beauty and nuanced atmosphere of its world create a feeling quite unlike in any other game. Its simple gameplay premise of giving new meaning to the often overlooked action of moving from point A to point B is an incredibly brilliant one. Most of all, Death Stranding's story is a beautiful tale with excellent themes and characters riddled throughout. I just wish it wasn't one so often broke up by lackluster pacing and boring, repetitive deliveries. I wish the ordinary NPCs of this world were ones that were worth helping. I wish the vehicles and structures and the ability to interact with other players, which are ideas with great potential, were more fleshed out and interesting to engage with. I just wish Death Stranding was the masterpiece I believe it showed flashes of being. While I can't call Death Stranding a masterpiece due to its several glaring faults, I would still say this is a really good game with a lot of brilliance behind it. Despite the issues, I'm leaving this experience with a newfound appreciation for Kojima's innovative approach to game design, and I'm hopeful that the sequel can reach the level of excellence I know it's capable of. Ultimately, Death Stranding is neither a masterpiece or a mess. It's a fragile thread woven between brilliance and frustration, and for that, it's unforgettable in a unique sort of way.